Hey, good morning, everyone. My name's Steve David, he, him, his. I am the Advocacy Director at the Ohio State University College of Social Work, and really grateful to have you joining us for this last day of the 2021 reentry week. This is our policy and practice panel, and as one of our panelists said in our planning emails, this is an incredibly powerful group of people that you have here. So I'm truly grateful to be doing the moderation today, and thankful to you all for jumping on and being part of this. I'm going to do a couple, while we give folks a couple minutes to trickle in, I'm going to do a few thank yous and kind of just set the stage here for what we're going to do today. So I first want to send a big thank you to Dr. Patrice Palmer and Mr. Johnny Turner from the Franklin County Office of Justice and Policy Programs. I think many of us have had silver linings in our past pandemic year, and mine has definitely been working with Dr. Palmer on a number of events this past year. Just really grateful for Patrice and her tireless leadership in this area and inviting me to be part of the work. So I am the least knowledgeable person on your screen today, so I'm just going to give some quick housekeeping and then introduce our guest that we have today. A really awesome group of people here. So for logistics, this is a webinar, so your mic and video are turned off. As we go, you do have a Q&A function, so please use the Q&A to ask questions to your panelists. I'm going to start with some prepared questions today, but then I'll work in your questions throughout. So really looking forward to having this dialogue with you all. We do have captions for this, so there is a live transcript, a CC button on the bottom of your screen if you need captioning for this session. So finally, I do want to take a minute before we start today, just to kind of like recognize the moment that we're in, and take a moment to speak into the space, the amount of pain that we're seeing in our community right now, especially over this past week, and particularly amongst our Black neighbors, friends, and colleagues, just at witnessing this relentless loss of life at the hands of the state. And I also want to lift up the incredible bravery that we're seeing alongside this week, that we're seeing amongst those struggling for justice. So I hope that this time that we have today gives you an increased sense of urgency as well as agency to get engaged with this work ahead. So with that, I'm going to introduce this really awesome group of people that we have here. So I'm going to start first with Nikki Baczynski, who is the managing editor at The Point. So The Point is an editorial page focused on storytelling about policy, politics, and how the legal system shapes the lives of everyday people in America. She previously worked in the appeals and post-conviction section of the Ohio Public Defender, where she started the Ohio Public Defender's Racial Justice Initiative, which is a team focused on identifying racially discriminatory practices in departments across the state. So Nikki, thanks so much for being here with us today. Next, we have Claire Chevrier, who is policy counsel at the ACLU of Ohio. Claire manages the local and statewide efforts around pretrial advocacy and trying to fix Ohio's bail system. She previously practiced as the Equal Justice Works Fellow, providing free special education and legal advocacy for court-involved young people, and has extensive expertise around special education, civil rights, and work with low-income tenants. Claire, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Mr. Jason Knox. Jason is the Central Ohio District Director for Senator Rob Portman. Jason previously worked as staff assistant for Senator George Voinovich. And then when Senator Portman joined the Senate in 2011, Mr. Knox took on a number of roles in his office before assuming his current role as the Central Ohio District Director. Has been a great friend of the Office of Justice and Policy Programs and the College of Social Work as well. So Mr. Knox, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Mr. Kyle Strickland, who is the Deputy Director of Race and Democracy at the Roosevelt Institute, as well as the Senior Legal Analyst at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. If you haven't seen Kyle speak at something yet, I don't know what you're doing, but Kyle is an amazing advocate that we have here in town as well as in the state, currently leading a multi-year race landscape project for the Roosevelt Institute, focusing on the research, policy ideas, and political movement building around race, economics, and politics. Also the director of the My Brother's Keeper initiative under the Kirwan Institute in the state of Ohio. So Kyle, thanks for joining us today. Next, we have Pam Thurston, who is an attorney and civic leader at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. Pam joined the OJPC in 2010 to build the Ohio Collateral Sanctions Database, which became the Civil Impact of Criminal Convictions Database, or CIVIC, which is an online resource to catalog the 1,286 legal barriers that obstruct people with criminal records from returning to full life here in the state of Ohio. She currently does that work in a volunteer capacity and uses this knowledge to advance better understanding and sound reform for all phases of the criminal legal system. Pam, thanks so much for being here with us.
Thrilled to be here.
Next, we have Mr. Carlton Weddington, who's a project coordinator at the African American Wellness Agency. Carlton is a former state legislator for the 27th Ohio District, where he served on the Criminal Justice Committee and the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee and the Death Penalty Task Force. He's actually also seen both sides of the criminal justice system as a formerly incarcerated person, and he currently serves as a project coordinator working with the African American Wellness Agency to address mental health disparity and mental well-being of Black men. Carlton, so glad to have you joining us.
Thank you. Have a great panel today.
Yes, we do. And finally, last but not least, is Mr. Michael Zucherman, who's the Skadden Fellow at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. Michael's work is with the OJPC Second Chance Project, where he provides legal services to help people with past criminal convictions reintegrate into the community and build flourishing lives. And he will continue with that work, expanding the OJPC Columbus office. So, Michael, so glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So thankfully, Michael's last name starts with Z, so that is the end of my introductions. Now we get into the content here. So this is re-entry week, but I actually want to start with Claire and her work, kind of at the front end of the criminal justice system. So, the ACLU right now is driving this active campaign around bail reform in the state of Ohio. So Claire, can you take a minute to just kind of set the stage with what's wrong with Ohio's cash bail system and some of the work that y'all are doing to try and fix that entry point into the justice system?
Absolutely. So it's important to remember that, even though every state trial court in Ohio has to follow the United States Constitution and the Ohio Constitution and Ohio laws and Supreme Court of Ohio criminal rules, there's still a lot of variability with what somebody sees if they get, unfortunately, funneled into the criminal legal system. And so if you or I were arrested today, let's say for first-degree misdemeanor theft, it is likely that before we ever see a judge, we would have the opportunity to bond our way out of jail. And in most places in Ohio, that would be a question not of whether we pose a threat, not of whether we pose a threat to of fleeing justice, but just based on how much money we have in our pocket. And that's because every single municipal court in Ohio has a bond schedule. And a bond schedule is a table that lists on one side either a specific crime like theft or a crime category like first-degree misdemeanor, and then a corresponding usually dollar amount. Now, sometimes that is changing. There are different courts in Ohio that, will have different conditions of release on that bond schedule that aren't monetary. But across Ohio, most frequently what you'll see is a dollar amount that says you can buy yourself out of jail if you have this amount of money. And what that means is, again, if we go back to the example of you and I were arrested today for first-degree misdemeanor theft, if I had a lot of money, I could buy my way out. I could go home. I could if I had kids, I could tuck them into bed that night. I could go to work the next day. I could continue paying bills. And if you couldn't afford that amount of money, again, even if we were accused of the same thing, you would stay in jail. You wouldn't be able to pick kids up at school. You might lose your job. You might lose your housing. You could even start the process of losing custody of your children if you were remaining in jail and there wasn't anybody else who could care for them. So then the time frame between when we would see a judge would also vary across Ohio. In some places, you'd see a judge pretty quickly, maybe 48 hours. In other places, it's going to be a lot longer. There are some, especially rural areas in Ohio, where there are only arraignment courts a couple times a week. So if you get arrested, the evening of one of those days, you're going to be waiting a long time before you see a judge. And then, of course, once you're in front of a judge, you might again get a financial condition of release, which for some people means you'll post the money and you'll go home. And for other people, even a small amount of money might end up feeling like a de facto detention order, because if you can't afford the dollar amount, you stay in jail. And this is a huge problem. One, because the purpose of cash bail was to incentivize people to return to court, not to cause people to remain in jail unnecessarily. Two, we know that it's not actually a good incentive, that there's a lot of research that shows that there's no reason to use cash bail. If somebody wants to leave, they're going to leave, and most people want to come back, and it's pretty rare for anybody to actually flee justice. But we also know that the devastating consequences that occur when somebody is held in jail unnecessarily can be life-altering, and those life-altering changes can happen after just a few days in jail. So I listed some of them, but then also it turns out that you're more likely to get convicted if you remain in jail pre-trial. And that unfortunately makes sense because you might feel coerced into taking a plea deal. Again, if you go back to our example, if one of us was able to go home and await trial, maybe you'll feel more confident about toughing it out until you have your day in court. But if you're going to remain in jail the entire time, you might not feel like you have the privilege to fight your case because you might have to stay in jail for days or weeks or months before you actually get that opportunity. And unfortunately, what this all boils down to is, one, wealth-based detention. People who can't afford to buy their release have worse outcomes. And two, it doesn't protect public safety. It means really dangerous people with a lot of money often go home, and people who pose no threat at all languish unnecessarily in jail. And so we need to be changing our pretrial system so that it doesn't hinge on whether or not somebody has money. We've been working really hard with a number of different people across the state, and we're hopeful that we will soon see statewide legislation that should address this. And I encourage everybody when they see that to support it, because we need to make sure that pretrial decisions are hinged on whether or not somebody actually poses a threat, not based on how deep their pockets are.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Claire. And if you have a way, if you want to drop in the chat for our panelists, a place where they can sign up for ACLU action alerts or something, so they can stay in the loop once that kind of legislation drops and help push that forward, that would be awesome. So next I want to turn to Nikki, actually, because these pieces that Claire mentioned about that the cash bail system doesn't necessarily it doesn't protect public safety. And it's kind of this like wealth-based detention system. I think like for a lot of people, there's this assumption that folks are in jail or prison because they committed a crime or they've been convicted of a crime, and this maintains public safety. However, you recently wrote a piece about technical violations of probation and parole and how these really drive incarceration and undermine public safety. So would you talk a little bit about this technical violations piece and why you're calling on states to do away with them or reform those practices?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Before I get into the violations, I figured I'd start with what probation and parole are. And different states use different terms. Here in Ohio, you're probably more likely to hear community control or post-release control. But essentially what we're talking about are terms of supervision. Probation being one that's imposed in lieu of incarceration as a result of a criminal conviction, and parole coming at the end of a prison sentence. And terms of supervision, in addition to this idea of technical violations and how they result in revocations, there's also concerns about just how long we keep people on supervision and how many conditions we impose on them, many of them arbitrary and just serving as tripwires in order to have them successfully complete this term of supervision. So this idea of technical violations, the easiest way I understand it and the way I think a lot of people talk about it is anything that's not the commission of a new crime. So that might be not making your curfew, being late for an appointment with your probation officer, associating with someone who has a criminal conviction. All of those things can be included in your term of supervision as a condition. And if you were to violate it, it gives your probation officer, parole officer, judge, the discretion to impose a term of incarceration. You can often be held in detention just because you were accused of a technical violation. In New York, people spend weeks, sometimes months, in detention at Rikers because of an accusation that there was a technical violation of parole or probation. This idea that it undermines public safety, I think, can be illustrated by an example that a guest in one of our shows on Appeal Live talked about, Vincent Schiraldi of the Columbia Justice Lab. So he tells a story of a man who was, released from prison, was on parole, and one of the conditions of his term of supervision was curfew. You need to be home by 7 p.m. every night. Well, the organization that he was working with got him a really good job, great paying job, career path job. And But it would be something where his shift would go beyond that curfew. So he needed permission from the parole officer to take this job and work at the job. And the first parole officer was totally fine with that, gave him permission. Within a year, though, he had 4 different parole officers. The first one, the second one, and the third one all gave him permission. The fourth one showed up his door one day. He wasn't there at curfew and issued a warrant for his arrest because of that violation. So he spent 6 weeks incarcerated, pending a determination by an administrative judge as to whether or not his parole would be revoked. And the judge did not revoke the parole, but at the end of that 6 weeks, he said he came into Rikers with a job, a girlfriend, an apartment, and a car. And he left Rikers without any of those things. And so when we think about what are those things that we emphasize help reduce recidivism and increase stability in people's lives, he lost all of them. And he got them. I mean, impressively, he was able to secure them, even though we put so many obstacles in people's way to actually get those things. He got them all, and they were all taken away because of a technical violation of parole and the discretion of one particular officer. So it seems very illogical to think that these responding to technical violations, essentially rule violations in this way, promotes public safety and personal stability. You mentioned that people assume those who are in prison are there because they've committed new crimes. There's a report by the Council of State Governments that actually technical violations, incarcerating people in our prisons for those, costs $2.8 billion annually. And as many, I think, as nearly 1/4 of all prison admissions are because of technical violations. Just people getting their parole revoked and going back to prison because they broke a rule. No commission of new crime. So it's a huge problem. And I think there's legislation that's trying to fix it, but obviously it's still something that's going on.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that story, Nikki. It is so compelling, and I really appreciate the storytelling work that you all are doing. If you have a link to that live piece, like, we'd love to see it in the chat. But I think, like, the arbitrariness of this kind of flows into this piece that I want to send to Pam. So Pam, I think there's this when we're thinking about people who are incarcerated and then they leave, there's this assumption that that folks have paid their debt to society, right? Or that they've done their time served. So can you talk a bit about your work around collateral sanctions and some of these pieces, these debts that follow people long after they've actually left a correctional facility, and sometimes for the rest of their lives?
You've pretty much gone to the heart of the problem of collateral sanctions. I mean, the phrase collateral sanctions or collateral consequences that scholars use kind of conceals the real difference it makes in people's lives. It's a fancy name for laws and regulations that discriminate against people, or that require or allow employers, landlords, and school systems to discriminate against people because of their criminal record. The civic database that OJPC built calls them civil impacts because they have an ongoing impact on a person's life in civil society after they've supposedly paid their debt to society. So essentially, civil impacts convert a criminal sentence or a criminal penalty into a life sentence. It's true that different collateral sanctions in Ohio law have different supposed duration. Some of them are supposed to last a lifetime. Many others are supposed to last anywhere from 6 months to 20 years. It varies enormously, but they have in common that there is a lifetime impact regardless, because even a short-term delay in getting to start your schooling, your training, or your career puts you behind your peers in the race for opportunities and advancement. So, and we've learned that, not too surprisingly, given the way the criminal legal system works, these lifetime impacts also fall most heavily on Black people. And in 2018, OJPC and Policy Matters Ohio published a report called Wasted Assets that was designed to correlate people with criminal records in Ohio to the economic impact on the state as well as the individuals of depriving people of the opportunities in their lives when they get out. Are directly restricted by civil impacts in Ohio laws and regulations. At the same time, in 2017, nearly 1 in 4 Black residents of Ohio had a felony record. That statistic for non-Blacks was 1 in 17. So Black people had 4 times as were deprived of access to economic opportunity at 4 times the rate that non-Black people were. It becomes a self-perpetuating problem for the community as well as for individuals. In fact, I mean, the statistic that I just used is way too broad to be something that could be given legal significance that you could sue on. It makes it pretty clear that exclusion from work based on a criminal record is essentially a proxy for exclusion of work from work based on color. Whether legislators always intend that or whether employers always intend that when these rules and laws are being applied, doesn't matter. That's the way the effect works. Some good news may be on the horizon right now. April 12th was the first effective date of a new law that was passed in late last year that's being called the Fresh Start Act. There's a lot left to be seen about what happens under the Fresh Start Act. It doesn't affect all the collateral sanctions in Ohio by a long shot, but it is very broad-based. It applies to almost all agencies, state agencies that issue licenses to individuals. And it would be amazing, you'd be amazed at how many areas of livelihood require a license in Ohio. The biggest change is a fundamental change in approach record that will automatically bar you from getting a license. That could be huge. Under the new law, really quickly, most licensing agencies will have to publish a list of all the offenses that might end up barring a person from getting a license. The disqualifying offenses have to be directly related to the duties and responsibilities of the licensed occupation. And agencies are only allowed to consider offenses that are on their list when they consider a person's qualifications for a license. They are no longer allowed to consider moral character or to exclude someone based on an offense of moral turpitude, which the code is full of at this point. So there's less room for arbitrary discretion. If the criminal record, if a person comes to an agency applying for a license and has a criminal record that contains offenses not on the list, the agency just can't consider them. If the person has 1 or more convictions for offenses that are on the list, the agency can consider them under restricted circumstances. Offenses of violence or sexually oriented offenses can be considered forever. This cannot. If your offense involved a breach of fiduciary duty, the agency can consider it for 10 years. Otherwise, 5 years is the limit. After 5 years, the offense doesn't count. If your record includes offenses that the agency is allowed to consider, it has to consider them in light of 5 factors that are listed in the statute. And those are the nature and seriousness of the offense, how long ago it occurred, the relationship of the offense to the duties of the job, any evidence of rehabilitation or treatment, including CAE or CQE certificates, which Mike Zucherman will tell us about in a few minutes, and whether the denial of the license is reasonably necessary to ensure public safety. There are many things, as you can just hear going through this, there are many things that are going to be left to practice to see what really happens. There is potential to apply these rules that really make a difference in the lives of people with records in Ohio, and there's potential to continue the bureaucratic foot on the neck. We're going to have to see what happens, and continue advocacy. Then I'll be happy to answer questions about more details about the law later, and I'll post a few links.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Pam. Please do drop those links in the chat. And you queued up my next question to Michael about kind of digging into some of these things and how we do remove some of these barriers. So Michael, like your work, Pam kind of cast this broad picture for us. This piece, like 1 in 4 Black folks in the state of Ohio like having a felony conviction, how that like locks them out of opportunity. So can you like tell us a story about how you've seen some of these barriers impact families and communities and the work that you're doing to try and remove those for folks?
Sure. I mean, we call this a second chance project. First thing to say is, it's really about another chance, right? The third chance, fourth chance is about making sure that the past doesn't haunt people forever. And it can look all different ways. So I use the phrase second chance, but what I really mean is another chance. And at its core, what that's about is helping someone get back to where they want to be to build what for them feels like a flourishing life. So for a lot of people, that's a barrier to employment, a barrier to housing, but it's sometimes something else. It can be about education. It can be about being able to volunteer at your child's school. We've had clients for whom it was about being able to see their children or their grandchildren. That was part of their reentry journeys. So helping someone make the most of a second chance or a third chance, a fourth chance, it's really about making sure that because someone has a conviction, that's not going to haunt them forever. They're going to be able to build a future despite what's in the past. So what often gets in the way is what Pam was talking about, which are these things that we kind of academically call collateral consequences, and they're barriers that aren't technically part of a person's sentence, but it can sure seem like they are. I think I just want to underscore, you heard from Pam, there are a bunch of these. There are over 1,000 laws and regulations on the books in Ohio at last count that can limit a person's ability to just earn a livelihood. 1,000 laws and regulations. So someone could have been a fantastic nurse or teacher or any number of other professions before their conviction, or they had dreams to become one, and their conviction might make that legally impossible, which of course also means increased economic vulnerability for them, for anybody that they help support. I had a client once who she'd been to college, she had a successful career, and then a domestic altercation caused her to pick up a felonious assault charge. It was an F2. She had to do probation. It was a first offense, so she was able to do probation, but it met all of these career impediments for her. Her financial situation completely fell apart. All of a sudden, she could only get low and minimum wage jobs. She couldn't get work with any health benefits. Even when she would get provisionally hired, she would be let go after a background check came back. She had to move in with her family because she couldn't afford to live by herself anymore. And what's striking about this situation is, for this client, it is not that she didn't have the skills or motivation or network to succeed. She had a college degree. She had a great attitude and excitement and drive. She had an employer who was eager to take her under her wing. She just wasn't allowed to do the job that she wanted to do by the laws and regulations of the state of Ohio. So there are things we can do in those situations. Not the same type of relief fits everybody. The most common thing we talk about is record sealing, which just hides a record from public view. still available to some people for some purposes. Her conviction couldn't be sealed because it was an F2, and the record sealing laws are pretty complicated, but unfortunately, one of the straightforward rules is that F1s and F2s, I mean, first degree and second degree felonies, can't be sealed no matter how much time has passed. There's also something called certificates of qualification for employment, or CQEs. Those are orders from a court of common pleas that eliminate most of the mandatory barriers, those things we call collateral consequences or civil impacts to employment. And it also provides employers with immunity from negligent hiring liability. So it solves an anxiety that they report having. That's what we were able to do in this situation. So it meant all of a sudden, when the court granted this relief for our client, she was able to get the license she needed to be employed in the field she wanted to be employed in. The legal barriers were lifted. That's not to minimize the fact that she still faces stigma. There's still serious issues she faces, but she's no longer formally blocked from pursuing her dreams. Just real quickly, there are other approaches we sometimes have to take. Sometimes state boards simply don't want to license people, even though they're eligible, right? They treat the convictions as like a lifelong poison pill. And even though it doesn't have to be under the law. And so sometimes we can help people try to just tell their stories to the licensing boards to help the boards understand that everyone is like, Sister Helen Prejean and Brian Stevenson remind us, more than the worst thing they've ever done. And we can also, there are also pardons. We can help people apply for pardons from the governor. The governor's office recently launched what it calls the Expedited Pardon Project. In my view, it's still open to fewer people than it should be, but hopefully they will open it up. And in the meantime, we can help people who do qualify for it apply for expedited pardons, and we can help people who don't qualify for it apply for regular pardons. There are other tools as well, but those are some of the main ones. I just wanted to give a quick overview. Again, it's really about helping people build the lives they want and to be able to provide for themselves and their families. It's whatever people feel will be a flourishing life for them, helping make sure that the fact they have a conviction doesn't preclude them from pursuing that for the rest of their lives.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Michael, and for the work that you're doing with individual people and lifting this up on a broad scale. I want to take this piece about kind of like the labyrinth rules and regulations around the civil impacts and kind of what I think you and Pam have illustrated about this disconnect between people's lives afterward and how the law treats them. And I want to toss this over to Carlton because Carlton, you have this really unique perspective of both being on the policymaking and oversight side as a legislator and a member of the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee, but then are also a formerly incarcerated person and have seen how these systems play out in real life. So what do you think is the source for some of this disconnect that we see between how policies are actually implemented and the way that people live them out in their lives?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for this opportunity. I think you've actually heard from some of the panelists thus far what is the current status in terms of how we see a victim and at that point would be the defendant, the two patterns and the levels of the process that they go through. Typically, as a legislator and legislative bodies, we try to give emphasis on the victim in terms of making the system work for them and that the system is accountable for them. I believe that is in our truest form, our purpose, to make sure that we support and help those who have been victimized. But when you look on the other side, the defendant that then becomes the convicted and then becomes a prisoner, we need to hold ourselves accountable as well as the system accountable to be accountable to those individuals as well. Because as they are expected to be corrected and rehabilitated, we want them to come out and be productive citizens. but you hear about the collateral damages, collateral sanctions. And so the disconnect becomes, where is our responsibility at that point for those individuals? Because if they are not able to have the life that they would like to be successful, then they may end up right back in the system that we put them in. And I have a unique situation where I had the education, I had the positive experiences and the support system to enable me to now in my current state still be a productive citizen, feel that I am doing the work that I wanted to do prior to. But everybody doesn't have that experience. Everybody doesn't have that story. And so we have to understand that those individuals that weren't actually rehabilitated, that the correction that they had been given did not actually work. They don't have the education, they don't have the funding, they don't have the support system. And we have to figure a different way of addressing those individuals. You know, at the African American Male Wellness Agency, when we talk about workforce development, we talk about the untapped workforce. Those are potentially these individuals that we work with. We hear on a daily basis corporations who are in need of workers and want to hire. But the disconnect is they won't hire a person with record. They say they will, but they don't. The disconnect is when, as it was mentioned early on about either being on parole or probation, it's hard to work with someone who truly doesn't want to work with you. And so they're always finding a way to put you in a situation that you can't provide for yourself. And so you end up back into the system. I've seen that not specifically through my own experience, but being next to a person who's seeing the same person, and I'm sitting back and just listening to the conversation. Like, this person is never going to get ahead because this parole officer is really not trying to support him or help him. If he comes home with no money and you're asking him to pay a fee for him to be monitored, where's he going to get the money from? And so having that experience, unfortunately for myself, to have been a legislator in the Ohio House, and then being governed by those same rules and regulations. You know, when I sat on the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee, what we were shown was what they wanted us to see. But when I was there and we had those same administrators and staff come, it was amazing to see how things were cleaned up for the purposes of those tours, where people were not allowed to speak or be seen because they wanted to paint a picture for that committee. And the problem is that oftentimes we are trying to show a picture that is not true. And so the result of that is you don't have the proper rules and regulations in line to address the real problem. If folks are telling you that the water is bad, that the facilities are not good, they're not making it up. It's true. But if you don't ever see that, you won't know how to correct it. And so I think that's a issue that we have to deal with. I think that's why you have some of the disconnect you have now. I mean, if we were doing everything that all of these panels and the panelists talked about throughout the week, if we actually did this and followed through, then we'd actually be putting ourselves out of business. And that's good because we'd be doing the right thing. But we're not doing that. So the disconnect is there, and it will continue to be there until we get more legislators, more administrators to act as they say they will act, opposed to how they choose to act.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Carlton, and sharing your personal experience. And I like the way that you segue to like what kind of like the legislative fixes that we need, and like getting people to act in a way in accordance with like what is kind of the sound policy based on what we're actually seeing. So I want to toss it to Jason next and kind of like zoom up from the state to the federal level. So Jason, like you've worked with Senator Portman as he's like supported legislation around justice and addiction policy reform, things like CARA and the Second Chance Act. So what do you think are some of the important accomplishments that have been made? And perhaps more importantly, like what do you see as some of the viable steps forward to continue to push some of this along in your work?
Great. First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the senator. And I just want to say up to this point, it's been very informative from all the panelists. And wow, that was just a great perspective from Carlton. And I think that, you all, if you're not familiar with me, or if you haven't, interacted with Senator Portman's office, please don't hesitate. I'll certainly put my contact information in the chat when I'm done. But, we're always looking for new people to get feedback to inform Senator Portman's policy on addiction, on second chance reentry efforts. I think all of your perspective would be welcomed to the senator and also our staff out in DC. I just want to go over a couple pieces of legislation that we're working on. One is we just recently reintroduced it. It's called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act 3.0. So the first iteration of that bill was passed back in 2016 by some pretty large bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate. It was the most comprehensive drug legislation since 2007 up to that point. And I think that through that legislation, the 21st Century Cures Act, there was this large, federal awareness and funding that was being poured into these programs. And we started to see some progress. In 2018, there was a nationwide 24% reduction in overdose deaths nationally. And, every year up to that point, we had seen a troubling trend going up. But unfortunately, as we all know, with the COVID situation, it's been a huge setback. And unfortunately, 81,000 people died from a fatal drug overdose between June of 19 and May of 2020, which is the highest 12-month period in our nation's history. So the need for, in our view, new legislation, an increased investment in these programs is needed. And so the senator introduced CARA 3.0 to build off of some of the success and sort of position ourselves better as we come out of the COVID pandemic. Some provisions in the bill would create a national drug awareness campaign, would also take the important step of addressing the disproportionate effect the addiction crisis has on people in poverty and communities of color through a national commission to help develop better treatments and best practices for overdoses. It will also double down on proven evidence-based addiction treatment methods while expanding treatment options for groups particularly vulnerable to addiction, including young people, new and expecting mothers, rural communities, and communities of color. It will make permanent the current expanded telehealth options for addiction treatment that were created in response to the social distancing required by the COVID-19 pandemic. The bill would also enable physicians to provide medically assisted treatment like methadone and buprenorphine to a greater number of patients, also allowing those drugs to be prescribed via telehealth, as we're seeing a lot more addiction treatment taking place over in a telehealth fashion. CARA 3.0 funds a Department of Justice grant to help incarcerated individuals struggling with addiction to receive medication-assisted treatment while they are still in the criminal justice system. We feel that this is a key step in breaking the cycle of incarceration. It also empowers law enforcement officials to immediately direct individuals they encounter struggling with addiction to appropriate treatment services instead of arresting them. This will help reduce stigma, help more people get treatment, and minimize the risk of overdoses. So if CARA 3.0 were to be passed, combined with the programs that were already set up by its previous versions, we would be, as a nation, investing over $1 billion annually to address this epidemic. And based on the severity of the situation that we've seen caused by the isolation and everything involving COVID, we feel that that is a necessary investment. One thing I want to switch over to, Steve mentioned the Second Chance Act, which has been was passed in 2008 when Senator Portman was in the House and was co-sponsored by the late Stephanie Tubbs Jones of Cleveland. And what happened in 2018, they passed and signed the First Step Act, which included in that the reauthorization of the Second Chance Act. And the original Second Chance Act focused largely on supporting research to identify best practices in correctional education programming. And the reauthorization in 2018 moved to put more of that into practice, and the funding is dedicated to examining and implementing the educational approaches proven to work best for people in prisons, jails, and juvenile facilities. The reauthorization also expanded the types of entities that can receive funding through the grant programs. Under the Reauthorization Act, nonprofit organizations are now eligible to receive the funding to provide career training and substance addiction services. And so that is a program that's funded annually at around $90 to $100 million. And that's something that the senator is always pushing and urging with his colleagues to increase the funding levels in that program, because we've seen a lot of that money come back to Ohio over the years, and has had a great impact on helping folks that are incarcerated. And obviously, one of the things the senator always says is, 95% of people who are incarcerated are going to get out. They're going to get back into society. And what we want to do is put them in a position where they are, they have as little barriers as possible to get back to being a productive member of society. And as we've heard on the panel, we're still not there yet. I mean, we've made some progress on certain things, but there's a long way for us to go. One other thing I wanted to mention is last year, Senator Portman introduced the bipartisan, as we were seeing with COVID, the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a lot of businesses were taking advantage of to sort of get through the rough period of COVID. And the senator introduced, what we were seeing is that some of those loans were not going to businesses where the owners had unrelated felony records. So we introduced a bill and we're able to get passed called the Paycheck Protection Program Second Chance Act that would remove those barriers to PPP funds for owners that have unrelated felony records. Another bill I want to mention, because it hasn't been passed yet, and we're hoping to sort of push this during this Congress, is the Eviction Crisis Act. So as we know, housing is obviously a huge barrier to folks that are returning from incarceration. And so we introduced it last Congress, and we're going to reintroduce it again this Congress. It's bipartisan legislation, and it will shed light on the root causes of the eviction crisis, reduce preventable evictions through a program that has funding associated with it, to where if somebody was reaching a point where they were, in a financial crunch where they might be facing eviction, there would be payments that could help them get through that, because we know that once someone is evicted, or keeping someone in their home is way more beneficial than obviously dealing with everything that comes with the after effects of an eviction. It would also limit the devastation when eviction is unavoidable by getting the eviction off of the record as soon as possible. The senator feels stable housing is a vital part of getting people back on their feet, and this legislation will help prevent avoidable evictions, reduce homelessness, and make it easier for people to escape poverty by keeping a roof over their head. So those are just, I don't want to take up too much more time, but those are some things that we have enacted in the past that we're seeing working in very substantial ways, and then sort of what we see as the future and what the senator is going to work on in his last 2 years in the Senate. And one other thing I would be remiss without mentioning is, I know Dr. Patrice Palmer is on, and the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, some of the grants that went to Franklin County were what brought me and our office in touch with Dr. Palmer and her work with the Pathways program. And she has been a very helpful resource to the office, to the senator, to myself, and a great friend. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. So that's
Awesome.
all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason. You know, for all that, and kind of like laying out like some of the things that are moving, and also like for your leadership in this area. You know, I love the story that Patrice sometimes tells of, like when she was like one of these was doing a group with like currently incarcerated women, and you know, it was the first time that group was meeting, and she also had like a guest. I don't know if it was you, Jason, or the senator himself, but like either way is like something that would be immensely stressful for me to consider doing in my job. You know, and Dr. Palmer like does those things so gracefully. So yeah, we're really grateful to have her and her leadership here. So with that, I'm going to toss it to Kyle then, because you know Jason did a great job of laying out like some of the things that are in play, and you know, places where we can advocate personally or as our organizations. You know, so Kyle, like your work like kind of spans a lot of stuff. You know, like you look at like historical as well as contemporary policy, as well as interventions at the national level. You know, and stuff that you do like at the local level and like with like individual youth. So like, how can people like effectively situate themselves within this policy landscape everyone's laid out when there are so many places for folks to intervene?
Yeah, so thanks, Steve, and thanks so much, some esteemed panelists here. It's pretty great to be on this panel, and grateful to be part of Central Ohio Reentry Week. Always good to have Steve as a moderator. So we have two systems of justice in this country. Plain and simple. And there are those who would like to say that that is not the case. But I think the facts lay it out, that there are two systems of justice in this country. And it is part of a long history of white supremacy, of slavery, of oppression, that isn't just something that happened in the past, but occurs and permeates in our institutions today. And if we do not have that frame, if we do not have that lens when we approach these issues, then we will continue to have these same issues 100 years from now. And unfortunately, there are those who are denying things like systemic racism and its pervasive effects on our society, and where we see most of those disparities play out with life outcomes and ultimately with your ability to determine the shape and structure of your life. And that's within our criminal legal system. And if we just deny the structural barriers and act as if the system that we have set up is just inevitable, then we are not going to move to where we need to be. You know, so this history that a lot of people like to ignore, right? Somehow they think slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, and post-civil rights era, and they think the progress that we've made since the civil rights movement has been sufficient. They say, well, we've provided opportunities, we've ended state-sanctioned discrimination by law, and so now it's just up for everybody else to take the opportunities that are available to them. When we know that the progress has not been sufficient. Yes, we've made some progress, but we also know that there are barriers that continue in this day and age to continue to keep people behind. And that happens within our criminal legal system. And I think the reason why this is important is because it shouldn't be controversial to say that we have two systems of justice in this country. And it happens to do with the color of your skin, because we know racism in America is a crisis in this country. We have all sorts of communities across the country and across our state that are declaring racism as a public health crisis. And as Carlton mentioned before, you have a lot of people on panels and community engagements who say the right things, but are actually not doing the right things when it comes to the action and the implementation. There are those who are also liking to ignore our history, the history of Black codes that put Black people into forced labor and convict leasing, and seeing all of this history and the criminalization of those in the civil rights movement who are trying to protest for racial equality and justice. And instead of them having the opportunity to protest for freedom, they were getting deemed as lawbreakers and rioters, and those who continue to loot and destroy our society. Those sound like familiar refrains, because we hear that in today in 2021, when there are those actively right here, even in the State House here in Ohio, that are trying to make it harder and harder to exercise your free speech about these very same issues. And for whatever reason, this ignorance of this history is also denying what we just saw on January 6th, where those who were emboldened and incited around white supremacist ideologies to try and steal and overturn a democratic election. And the reason why I bring all of this up is because it's all connected to these issues of racial justice. And so it's not enough for us to just think that racial justice and dealing with the criminal legal system is just over here in a silo. It's interconnected in all of our systems, our education systems, our healthcare systems. All of these systems are connected. And that's why it's also not enough just to do a few things in one area to say, hey, we are doing this in this area, we're making a difference in this area. Yes, that is important. We want to have policy, we want to have legislation, we want to have advocacy in those areas. But we can't also then be in other areas and actively gutting things like the social safety net, actively gutting the very services that many of our communities depend upon and keep them from falling into this cycle. Because there is an ideology and a belief that somehow the circumstances that you are in are the result of your flaws, your own behaviors, and have nothing to do with the unjust systems and structures that have created those disparities in the first place. And that pervasive ideology permeates itself everywhere we go. So it affects the way we view people who are in poverty. It affects the way we view people who are in the criminal legal system. And it ultimately affects the way we think whether or not somebody is deserving to live or deserving to die. It's our ability to justify the inequality and the vulnerability we see today as, well, that was on them. They are somehow on their own. And we deny the humanity of people. And so we have to call that out. We have to call that out because we are working in a system right now where policymakers are actively undermining the very things that we're trying to do here. And we all know it's true. We all know it's true. We speak behind closed doors about these very issues, but we need to speak truth to power about these issues because we know that we have continued to say everything that we possibly could about addressing these issues and then doing everything to undermine them at the same time. And so we have to talk about this history and we have to recognize that this is an issue that is a crisis of our time. And so it requires addressing systemic racism. And people who deny systemic racism, one, they're ignoring the lived experiences of so many in our community. And two, they are not serious about addressing the justice in this country and the injustice that we have. And so that has to be the first question we ask ourselves and ask others about whether or not they're serious about tackling these issues. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Kyle. You know, and this piece about connections really resonates with me. And, you know, so like I'm a social worker by training. And, you know, you mentioned like the social safety net is something where a place where these same kind of issues intersect. And I'm thinking about, you know, hearings that happened at the State House where their, you know, representatives have pictures of you know, drug paraphernalia next to SNAP cards and kind of this pervasive criminalization we see of people in poverty and how these narratives intertwine. So I want to open this question up to the entire panel now about, you know, like so much of Reentry Week has been about this piece about connections, you know, either connecting people with ideas or directly connecting people with service, like the amazing work that, you know, the county's doing around this. So I'd like to ask all of our panelists, like, what is one connection you think is important for people to start making around the criminal legal system and how it functions?
If I might begin? Sure. I think one connection that I think speaks to what Kyle was saying, and I hope will resonate with everyone else, is put yourself and your family in some of these situations. See, what we see today, often on television over the past year, is the effects on Black people. The violence against Black people. And I call it violence because what has happened to all of these young Black men and women and people of color has been violence by law enforcement in some cases. We've also seen violence among young Black youth, as we saw with the young lady here in the city of Columbus, Ma'Khia Bryant, who she was in a situation with some other young Black women. But if the roles were reversed, if those young Black women were young white women and the police officers were Black, and George Floyd was white and those officers were Black, how would we then look at how we legislate? How would we look about our fellow man and woman? We have allowed over the past 4 years, and I want to start at the top, we have allowed our federal administration and leaders to dehumanize and make actions that otherwise would be outlandish normal. As Kyle talked about what happened on January 6th. What if the roles were reversed? Would that have happened? And so I want people to understand that, because that's the feeling that we have. And I don't let me speak out of turn, Kyle, but those are the feelings that we have. When I look at what goes on in life, I have to look at things black and white, because every day I have to have an understanding of what my every move is going to be when I get stopped by the police. I'm concerned if I'm going to leave from that point moving forward. And so I want everybody to take that perspective when we talk about the connections and how you actually view your work and how it will affect others.
I'd love to not exactly answer this question and kind of flip it on its head, because I think it's important to recognize that all of the best practices that I'm sure were discussed throughout this week, throughout this reentry week, every time we talk about the need for increased support and decreased supervision opportunities, so many of these can be applied during the pretrial period and circumvent the introduction into the criminal legal system in the first place. You know, if we talk about housing is an excellent support for reentry, that could be the case pre-trial. Connection to jobs, connected to social services, connections to social workers, all of those things could be done at the front end. And if we created that reality, then there would be a lot fewer people entering the system in the first place. There would be a lot fewer people suffering under the systems of collateral sanctions. There would be a lot fewer people whose lives are, upended because they've entered the criminal legal system. And we need to be focusing on how we can provide support instead of just supervision. And that's especially important because often when I talk about, no need for people to enter the criminal legal system in the first place, I often get the pushback of like, the ACLU wants to release the murderers. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of who's actually in our jails right now. Currently in Ohio, 63% of the people who are in jail pre-trial. So when I say pre-trial, I mean the period of time between arrest and a final disposition in a case, which could mean, conviction via plea deal, very rarely conviction via a jury, or a determination of innocence, or a case is thrown out for some other reason. During that time frame between arrest and disposition, when somebody is legally innocent, 63% of the people in Ohio jails during that pretrial period are there either on a misdemeanor charge or on a non-person felony, so a felony that does not involve contact with another person. And the most frequent charge in the state of Ohio for the non-person felony is drug possession. And the most frequent misdemeanor charge is driving under a suspended license. And then one of the second or third most frequent misdemeanor charges is driving without a license. We are putting people in cages when There's no reason to, when the only outcome of them being in cages is that their life is going to get destabilized. And we often hear the word recidivism thrown around. But what recidivism means is, unfortunately, likelihood of committing crimes later. And that makes sense, because if you destabilize someone's life, if you stop them from being able to get the job they wanted, if you stop them from being able to get a license, if you put them in a cage, if you remove them from their family structures, you're destabilizing someone's life in a way that makes us less safe, because people are, unfortunately, when you say the word recidivism, what you're saying is postponed crime and increased likelihood of crime. When in reality, if we got people services earlier, if it was a norm for people to have access to these services earlier, then we would recognize that the entire way that we use the criminal legal system should be less necessary. And we can also start to recognize how our criminal legal system makes us less safe, because we tear people's lives apart when they enter it.
Thanks so much for that, Claire. And I want to bring in a couple of the questions that we've seen come up in the Q&A box here. One that's really jumping out to me is this thing that Emily mentioned about what I think some of us know is the school to prison pipeline, and how youth, particularly youth of color, are funneled out of the education system and into the justice system. She raises this issue of police and schools here, and so if anyone has any interest in taking that one up, I want to put that out here. And then the other piece is someone mentioned about a law passed in April 21 about reducing F4s and F5s to misdemeanors. I'm not sure exactly what piece of legislation that it reminds me of, the stuff we were talking about last session, but has this question about record sealing and expungement. So if anybody is down to take up either of those.
Steve, I can jump. I was just typing an answer to the question about
cool.
The first one. I will defer to others who are more tuned into legislative policy. Unfortunately, I think that question may be about what was called Senate Bill 3, which my understanding is unfortunately did not pass. So that issue isn't, unfortunately, a live issue right now. The other thing I just wanted to say, and I will drop some links into the chat, there's very rarely a one-size-all-fits answer to anything about record sealing in Ohio. The system is pretty cumbersome and complex. I will drop in a link to a resource that our organization, Ohio Justice and Policy Center, created. It's a 2-page handout on kind of trying to navigate the how the record sealing laws work in Ohio. But I'm also going to drop in a link to register for our virtual record sealing clinics, where you can get individual advice about your record, and we can talk through individual situations, because there's almost never a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately.
Steve, you had the first question, and if you could restate that, I think I have an answer, or at least some thoughts on the school system and having resource officers there.
Yeah, so Emily kind of lifts up this observation about her work in the school system and children facing suspensions and expulsions K through 12, and just how school resource officers, in her view, have seen to exacerbate or be kind of the entry point of that problem, rather than dealing with youth in a way that kind of recognizes young people are young people and will occasionally do young people stuff.
Sure. So in a former life, I served on the Columbus Board of Education, largest public school system in the state of Ohio. At the time that I served, we had about 50,000 students under our care. We have, of the 16 high schools, there's one school that is for, or at that time, there was one school that was for students that had some disciplinary issues, a high school, a middle school, and an elementary school. I had the opportunity to tour the elementary school, Beatty. It was called Beatty at the time. And there's a room, and I was completely just shocked when I saw there's a room that looks like what would have been a storage space that had padded lining along the wall, and there was no door to it. But standing at the door was this large, obvious large man just standing there. I'm like, what is this? But this was the room in which they took students that were acting out. And I had a problem with it because, as you said, it just started to normalize the process of putting young people in a place of exclusion, similar to a cell. And we can't do this. We cannot do this because we're training our young people to act this way and to be put in this situation. I don't like it. And I told the principal about it. I went back to the board and I spoke about it. I don't know what they've done since then, but as it relates to resource officers, they have actually moved away from having officers on a daily basis in the schools. They may have it for special events, like sporting events and activities, but they're not the problem. You have to make sure that you have administrators and teachers that know how to address these young people properly and to actually be in control of their surroundings. That happens at the top in terms of that building. The building's environment is based off of your administrator and your leadership, but it also is based off of the teachers that you have involved with these young people. A young man the other day was speaking. He said, most of my life, I've been taught by a person that does not look like me, does not come from my neighborhood, and so does not really know how to interact with me. And that's an issue too, because oftentimes these teachers are not coming from the same neighborhoods and have that understanding. And what I'm talking about is cultural understanding. Cultural competency is the PC word. They're young, and when they see young people of color interacting, they're not quite sure how they should approach that. And so the disciplinary action becomes harsh. Put them out of the room so I don't have to deal with it, or suspend them from school so we don't have to deal with it. And so I think that's where lies the problem. I would not necessarily say it is the resource officer or the police officer, but there have been times when resource officers or police officers have been called to that location to address it. And depending on their frame of mind and their understanding of the situation, it could go very well or it could go very wrong. And so we have to address that as well, because we are seeing a lot of our young people, and disproportionately African-American or people of color, other races, ethnicities, I can't even say the word, ethnicities that are being disproportionately impacted by disciplinary action. And so we've got to address that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carlton. So I want to, I have three questions that I kind of want to like wrap messily into one, but these all involve kind of this piece about organizations and like people getting plugged in. So folks have asked about, like how do we connect people to ways to have meaningful conversations around these, like to write or lift up good policy, and particularly like folks who have been involved in the justice system, like what are some places where we can like plug folks into organizations or work that's happening? So many of y'all have active campaigns, and so anything that people see as like a good like entry point for folks that kind of want to continue this conversation after we wrap up here.
Go ahead, Pam.
Well, I have a lot of answers that are based on strictly personal experience that wouldn't really help very much. It's really a neighborhood matter, it seems to me, answering that specific question for particular individuals. But one thing that I think is an overarching factor that I'd like people to keep in mind is the voting booth. there's a couple of big issues. One is people with records often are induced or allowed to think that they can't vote. In Ohio, that is not true. Unless you are in prison or jail for a felony, you are eligible to register and vote. Even if you're in jail on a misdemeanor awaiting trial, you are eligible to register and vote. The ACLU has a really good, ACLU Ohio has a great page about who can vote and how that works, and some other resources. And I'll post that link if Claire doesn't get there first. But then the other thing is that almost, I was going to say everybody that affects the criminal legal system, but as other people point out, the school boards and everybody that creates the overall system and puts money into prisons before schools, that sort of thing. These are all people who are elected in Ohio. Judges are elected, and many people don't know that. And what happens to you or your cousin or your child who gets taken to court could depend on what you did in the last election at the voting booth. Municipal judges have incredible power in Ohio in the criminal system, and nobody even knows who they are unless they're in the system. It's hard to get information to vote for a judge because they're not listed by party. All the information you can find about them, for the most part, does not indicate which candidates belong to which party. And there are dynasties, political dynasties in Ohio. I don't know to what degree this mimics other states, but if I look at a list of judicial candidates on an Ohio ballot, at least half of them will have names that are the same last name as other judges that I'm familiar with, but they're not the same judge. So if I didn't do my research, I don't even know how to vote. League of Women Voters is great for that. There's a good starting place. There's a lot of other good resources for information about candidates. And I just urge people to take those opportunities.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Pam. I dropped vote411.org in the chat just because
Thank you.
When I do my voter education work, is always my go-to resource. Anybody else have an organ? And Pam, I really appreciate that point about like plugging in, kind of where you can. Anyone else want to make an organizational plug for the work that you're doing and how folks can get engaged with that?
I wanted to comment. There was a question, and I think Jason could also speak to this, representing Senator Portman. I think a lot of the disconnect in how we can connect folks to the process is understanding how to maneuver it, in its simplest form. A lot of people don't know that there is a district office right here in Columbus for Senator Portman, or how to even access to Jason, or if it be at the state level or at the city level. Who I have a city issue. Who do I talk to? Is it the mayor? Is it city council? I have a county issue. Who do I talk to? There's all these county departments. Do I go to the county commissioners? And oftentimes I had people who would ask me about snow plowing as a state representative, but that's not my job. Now, if you want to talk about snow plowing on the highways through the Ohio Department of Transportation, I might be able to assist you in some way. And so I think a positive connection for all of us is making sure people know how to access us. How do we call? Who do we call? When do we call? And what services can help me get to my solution? I think that's important. The other piece is, as it relates to legislation, there are so many people, and I found this amazing, that have never been to the State House. So not only do they not know about those elected officials, they don't even know how an idea becomes law. And I think that's a great opportunity for people to get involved, to understand how to work with each and every one of us here on this panel. Go to the State House, go to a committee hearing, get access where, pending on what they're voting on, and sit up in the gallery and watch the process in real time. I think those are some ways that you can get people activated, get them involved, and get them interested in what we do on a daily basis.
Mr. Knox, do you have a civic education and civic engagement plug you want to make?
No, I would just say Carlton hit the nail on the head. I mean, we have a lot of people don't realize that we have, our regional offices. We always try to spread that word. We have an office in Cincinnati, Toledo, Cleveland, and Columbus. And Senator Sherrod Brown has a similar setup. The offices aren't the exact same, but both offices have regional district directors that are supposed to be kind of the eyes and the ears for the senator in a region. My region consists of 14 counties in central Ohio. So, I live in Franklin County. I obviously it's the population center, but I spend some time out in the rural areas, meeting with constituents. And I think that people don't realize speaking with a staff member, because I think some people think that, if you're not speaking with the actual member, then it's not going anywhere. But I think people should know that, if you're speaking with a staff member, we interact with the senator on a regular basis. I'm after this panel discussion here, I'm going to start typing up my weekly report that I send to the senator every week. And this is going to be included, and a lot of the points that have been brought up are going to go directly to him. He reads those, he writes comments on them, he sends them back. So what I would say is not only at the Senate level, but also at the House level, they have teams of folks in the state. A lot of people think all the business is done in DC, and it's just not the case. I mean, most of our policy staff are in DC, but our regional directors like myself, we work directly with the policy staff. And, a lot of the ideas, I've worked for Senator Portman for over 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of ideas that have come from being ideas in Ohio that have come to, one of our team members or directly to the senator. And then since I've been around long enough, I've seen it get worked into a bill and become law in many instances. And so, knowing who those staff members are and developing a relationship with them is, can be very helpful.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Jason. I appreciate the euphemism of, like we talked to the senator where it's like, y'all are actually like the ones that do all the hard work. So appreciate you and, just like being in these spaces and continuing to, like make those connections about policy and the work that folks are doing here on the ground. So, we've got like 7 minutes left here before I close. So I want to just put out like one final question for anyone that has, quick answers or parting thoughts to it. And like earlier in sometime last summer, like a local activist that I know here in Columbus said, that activists need to rethink what we're asking for right now, because of this moment we're in, like it might not be big enough anymore. And that has really stuck with me since I heard her articulate it. So, kind of looking at like all of the momentum that we see and all the mobilization that's happening, what are some key opportunities that you all see happening, and like what should people be asking for in this moment?
I would just jump in, and this sort of gets to Claire and Carlton's earlier point. In so many ways, any social issue, we've defaulted to police and the carceral system to respond to it, which just expands those and makes them bigger and bigger. And I think we're in a moment where we're really questioning that initial response. Like, so for an example, we send police to mental health calls. And I think in years past, we've seen the very tragic results of that and have responded with, well, they need more training. Instead of reflecting on why is somebody with a gun and the ability to arrest the person we're sending to address a mental health crisis. Like, why is that our response? And if we do that for everything, so traffic stops, why are we sending people with guns to pull over people for a speeding violation or a traffic infraction? So many of the things that we want to solve as problems, we just default to police as the solution. Unfortunately, I do think we're in a moment where we're really re-examining that default response and coming up with better solutions, more effective solutions that are going to keep people safe and really reduce the harm that we're seeing. So that would be one idea or answer to that particular question, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Nikki. Yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I think we need to reimagine fundamentally what we mean by community safety in this country and in our communities, and center directly impacted communities, because too often we have those who are making decisions that will impact communities without actually centering those who are most impacted, those who are closest to the pain, right? And so we know that we need a fundamental redistribution of power in this country and in our communities, because too often we talk about access, we talk about opportunity, but we don't talk enough about the fact that people and communities don't have the power, are not provided with the power without being able to organize and being able to actually build together. And there's power in that. And that's why I think this movement is so powerful, because we know that no one entity can stand in the way of what people can do together. But we know that at the same time, there are active measures by the state and others to clamp down on that power. And sadly, unfortunately, anytime we see progress, especially when it comes to issues of racial justice, there is always backlash. And sadly, in this country, that has often been violent backlash fueled with white supremacist backlash. And so we have to call that out. We have to call that out because at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to reimagine these systems? And if you have, people like to debate on all the nuance of particular situations. They say, well, if we don't use police for these things, then what's going to happen here? Then, we got to worry about gun violence. Well, let's have conversations about common sense gun legislation here that we unfortunately don't talk about either. So there's so much here that it ultimately fundamentally is about recognizing the humanity of people and valuing our communities that have too often been exploited and left behind. We have to change the way we do our system in this country.
Could I add something to that point, Kyle? One of the reasons there's so much pushback against reimagining systems, as you talked about, is the amount of investment in the current system. The amount of money that has gone into the criminal legal system from all sources, weapons manufacturers, federal government, as well as our local budgets and taxpayers. That kind of money is going to be lost by all the people who've benefited from it if we quit using the legal system and law enforcement as the answer to everything. And so we need to be thinking about, and I don't know how to make it happen, but people with enough minds on it can figure something out. We need to be thinking and talking about what can correction officers do if they're not working in a prison? How can the people and other resources that we've put into law enforcement be used effectively to keep people out of the legal system in the first place? We talk about second chances, and somebody pointed out recently, we should be talking about first chances, because the huge number of the people who end up in the legal system, or who they don't end up there, but they get into the legal system, are there because they never had any first chances. They were in poor schools, poor neighborhoods, they were the wrong color, their parents were jobless, whatever it is. If we put our money and intelligence and human resources into giving people those first chances before they hit the legal system, we wouldn't need to spend the money on law enforcement and correction. So, how can we get away from those incentives?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Pam. And I feel like it is kind of like an excellent parting thought for us. We're on our last minute here, so I just want to send a huge thank you to the Franklin County Office of Justice and Policy Programs for making this happen. All of our panelists, y'all are amazing people. Thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. There's another program later at 11:30 where we're talking to judges about what they do. So please feel free to stick around for that. This Conversations from the Bench. But a big thanks to Johnny Turner and Patrice Palmer for bringing me into this, and all of our panelists for sharing their amazing knowledge with us. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.